J. Robert Oppenheimer was never meant to be trusted. He was too thin, too intense, too conflicted. In rooms filled with men who spoke in certainty and command, Oppenheimer hesitated. He questioned. He paused. And in times that demanded absolute confidence, hesitation was not seen as wisdom, it was seen as danger. From the beginning, he carried a question no one wanted to hear. What happens after we succeed? He did not fit the image of a savior, nor did he resemble a destroyer. He was something far more unsettling, a man who understood both outcomes at the same time. As a child, often sick and withdrawn, he learned early that the world was not simple. Books became his refuge. Poetry lived beside physics. Philosophy tangled with equations. Where others learned answers, Oppenheimer learned doubt. And doubt followed him everywhere. As a young academic, he was brilliant, but ineffective. Students struggled to follow him. Administrators questioned his authority. Colleagues admired his mind, but quietly doubted his strength. He did not inspire obedience. He inspired uncertainty. Security officials took notes. Superiors exchanged glances. This was not the man you gave power to. This was not the man you trusted with the fate of nations. And yet, beneath the uncertainty was something terrifyingly rare, an understanding of consequences. Oppenheimer did not ask whether something could be done. He asked what it would mean if it was. When war approached and the world demanded a weapon powerful enough to end all questions, the irony became impossible to ignore. The man least suited for moral simplicity was placed at the center of the most morally irreversible project in history. Some would later call him the man who helped end a war. Others would call him the man who opened the door to annihilation. But at this moment, before history chose its verdict, Oppenheimer stood trapped between two identities he never asked for. Was he preparing to save the world or teaching it how to destroy itself? Even he did not know the answer. All he knew was this: once knowledge is unleashed, it no longer belongs to the one who discovered it. And soon, he would be forced to live with a truth no thoughtful man should ever have to carry. War has a way of simplifying questions by making them unbearable. For J. Robert Oppenheimer, the question was never whether the world was capable of violence. History had already answered that. The question was whether refusing to act would make him complicit in something even worse. He did not rush toward the decision. He circled it. Europe was burning. Reports arrived in fragments, cities erased, lives reduced to numbers, the future shrinking by the day. In quiet offices, men spoke urgently about enemies, about urgency, about a race that could not be lost. They did not ask Oppenheimer to believe. They asked him to understand. And he did. He understood that if such a weapon was possible, someone would build it. If not him, then someone else. If not now, then later, without restraint, without doubt, without anyone willing to pause and ask what came after. This was the trap knowledge set for him. To say no felt like moral clarity. To say yes felt like moral surrender. But reality offered no clean exits. Oppenheimer knew he was not choosing between good and evil. He was choosing between evils that wore different masks. One promised immediate devastation. The other promised unchecked escalation. So he said yes, not with conviction, but with resignation. Yes, he would lead. Yes, he would organize. Yes, he would bring together minds sharper and more obedient than his own. And with that single word, his private doubts became public responsibility. At Los Alamos, the desert did not care about morality. It absorbed secrets easily. Barbed wire rose where questions ended. Brilliant men arrived, focused, driven, grateful for clarity. For many of them, the task was simple. Build what you are told to build. For Oppenheimer, nothing became simpler. He learned how to perform certainty, how to speak with authority he did not feel, how to silence questions long enough to meet deadlines. Each day required a version of himself he barely recognized. At night, alone, the doubts returned. He wondered whether history would remember him as a protector or a destroyer, whether ending one war would justify beginning an age that could never be undone, whether the line he had crossed was real or only visible to those who cared to look. The work advanced. The momentum became unstoppable, and slowly the most dangerous transformation took place. Not in the desert, not in the laboratories, but inside him. He stopped asking whether the project should exist. He began asking only whether it would work. That was the moment he understood the true cost of his decision. Not that he had helped build a weapon, but that he had learned how easily a thoughtful man could be trained to stop thinking. Momentum is a dangerous substitute for belief. Once Los Alamos began to function like a machine, it no longer needed justification. Schedules replaced questions. Progress replaced reflection. The project moved forward not because everyone agreed, but because stopping had become unthinkable. For J. Robert Oppenheimer, leadership became performance. He learned when to nod, when to reassure, when to push men harder than he believed was right. He spoke of timelines and targets while privately calculating consequences no one had asked him to compute. Each successful test tightened the invisible knot around him. Each solved problem brought them closer to a moment he could no longer imagine reversing. The men around him celebrated breakthroughs. Oppenheimer counted nights without sleep. He watched brilliant minds reduce uncertainty into numbers, probabilities, margins of error. What could not be quantified, fear, responsibility, aftermath, was quietly excluded from the room. And yet, he saw it all. He saw the weapon forming not just in metal and mathematics, but in habits, in the way urgency excused silence, in the way obedience began to feel like virtue, in the way doubt slowly learned to keep quiet. At times he tried to slow things down, raised concerns, asked for pauses. The responses were polite and final. There was a war to end, a race to win, no room for hesitation. Oppenheimer understood then that the project no longer belonged to him. It belonged to necessity, to fear, to a future already being written without his consent. Still, he stayed. Not because he believed more strongly, but because leaving would mean abandoning the last fragile influence he still had. If he could not stop the weapon, perhaps he could shape how it was born. Perhaps restraint, even minimal, was better than absence. This was the compromise that haunted him most. As the first full test approached, the air itself seemed to tense. The desert grew quiet, as if waiting. Men spoke less. Jokes disappeared. Everyone sensed that something irreversible was about to happen. Oppenheimer stood at the center of it, outwardly calm, inwardly unraveling. He knew that if the test succeeded, history would cross a threshold, and if it failed, the attempt alone would still change everything. Either way, there would be no return to innocence. On the night before the detonation, he did not pray for success. He did not pray for failure. He prayed for the strength to endure what knowledge had made inevitable. Because tomorrow, the world would learn something it could never forget. And so would he. The desert did not react at first. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing. No sound, no motion, no warning. Just a stillness so complete it felt unreal, as if the world itself had taken a breath and forgotten how to release it. Then, light. Not illumination, but domination. A brightness that erased distance, shadow, and scale. A force that made the sun feel suddenly inadequate. Men cheered, some laughed, others stood frozen, unable to process what their eyes were being forced to accept. J. Robert Oppenheimer did not move. He watched the sky transform into something ancient and alien. A pillar of fire climbing upward, rewriting the relationship between humanity and nature in a single violent gesture. In that moment, theory ended. Consequence began. He knew instantly that this was no longer a weapon. It was a statement, a declaration that the limits were gone. As the shockwave arrived, late and heavy, it carried with it a truth Oppenheimer would never escape. Whatever this ended, it had also begun something far worse. Later words would come, borrowed, almost unwillingly, rising from a place deeper than science. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. It was not a confession, it was recognition. Around him, history was already being simplified. The test was a success. The calculations were correct. The project had delivered exactly what was demanded of it. But success felt hollow. Oppenheimer smiled when required, spoke when asked, fulfilled the role expected of him. Inside, something had fractured beyond repair. The doubts he had learned to silence returned, not as questions, but as certainties. This could not be undone. This could not be controlled. This could not be owned by anyone who claimed responsibility. Soon the weapon would leave the desert. It would travel across oceans and into cities filled with people who had no say in its creation. Oppenheimer understood this before the orders were signed, before the planes were fueled. He had helped open a door that no one knew how to close. And the cruelest part was this: the world would call this moment a triumph. It would speak of necessity, of endings, of peace achieved through devastation. But standing there, watching the sky burn, Oppenheimer felt no victory. Only the weight of knowledge and the certainty that from this moment on, he would be judged not by what he intended, but by what he had made possible. The question that had followed him his entire life now had a shape, a sound, a temperature. Had he saved the world? Or had he taught it how to end itself? The war ended quickly. That was the justification. That was the sentence repeated until it sounded like truth. Cities vanished. Numbers were reported. History moved forward with alarming efficiency. J. Robert Oppenheimer stood on stages as a hero while feeling increasingly detached from the applause meant for him. Politicians shook his hand. Military officials praised his leadership. The world needed a face for what had happened, and his was convenient. But victory did not settle inside him. It pressed down. In the weeks that followed, he replayed moments he could not alter. The flash, the silence, the certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The weapon had done what it was built to do, and that was precisely the problem. He began to speak differently, not with pride, but with caution, not with celebration, but with warning. He urged restraint, spoke of limits, suggested that knowledge, once unleashed, required responsibility greater than ambition. The rooms grew colder. The same men who had demanded urgency now demanded silence. Doubt was no longer useful. Reflection was inconvenient. The war was over, and the future belonged to those who spoke in confidence, not conscience. Oppenheimer felt the shift immediately. He was no longer needed as a builder. He was becoming a reminder that victory carried consequences no one wanted to examine too closely. His warnings were tolerated at first, then ignored, then quietly resisted. He was advised to be careful, to moderate his tone, to remember his place, but he could not unlearn what he had learned. He had seen the edge of human capability and what lay beyond it. He knew that the greatest danger was not the weapon itself, but how easily it had been accepted as normal. At night, sleep abandoned him. The questions returned, heavier now because they were no longer hypothetical. Had he shortened one war only to lengthen all others? Had he prevented catastrophe or postponed it under worse conditions? The man once praised for his brilliance began to feel like a liability. Not because he was wrong, but because he would not stop speaking. And slowly, unmistakably, the tone around him changed. Admiration gave way to discomfort. Discomfort gave way to suspicion. The world had used his mind. Now it was preparing to distance itself from his conscience. And Oppenheimer, who had once feared being untrusted, began to understand something far more devastating. He was about to be punished not for what he had done, but for what he had learned. The reckoning did not come with violence. It came with paperwork, closed rooms, measured voices, questions asked not to understand, but to corner. J. Robert Oppenheimer sat beneath bright lights as his past was rearranged into suspicion. Old associations resurfaced. Casual conversations were stripped of context. Doubt, once tolerated, was now treated as evidence. He watched carefully chosen fragments of his life turn into a narrative he no longer recognized. This was not about secrets. It was about control. The man who had been trusted with unimaginable power was now deemed too dangerous to advise against it. His greatest crime was not disloyalty. It was memory. He remembered what had been unleashed, and he refused to forget. When the verdict came, it was quiet. No prison, no exile, just removal. Access revoked, doors closed, influence erased. He returned home not as a traitor, not as a hero, but as something more unsettling. A reminder that conscience does not age well in systems built on momentum. The world moved on, weapons multiplied, doctrines hardened. Certainty replaced caution. Oppenheimer faded into the background of the future he had helped create, watching from a distance as debates he had once led continued without him. He spoke less, reflected more. The urgency that had defined his life dissolved into a heavy stillness. He was asked years later how he wished to be remembered. He did not answer directly, because the truth was this: history would never agree on what he was. Some would say he helped end a war. Others would say he began an age of fear. But perhaps the more honest question was never what he did. It was what he understood before anyone else was ready to listen. Oppenheimer was not destroyed by ambition. He was undone by awareness. He stood at the moment humanity crossed a line. And unlike most, he never convinced himself it hadn't happened. So the judgment remains unresolved, suspended between relief and regret. Was he the man who saved the world by ending a war, or the man who taught it how to end itself? Maybe he was both. And maybe that is the most uncomfortable truth of all.